Imagine you are standing at the head of the most powerful army the world has ever seen. You have tens of thousands of soldiers, siege engines, battering rams, and elite warriors hungry for conquest. Before you lies Constantinople, the richest, most magnificent city in the entire world, full of gold and power. You expect it to fall within days, just as every other city has fallen before your unstoppable force. Instead, you sit outside its walls for weeks, then months, watching your army slowly starve and break apart. Then another empire tries, bringing even more soldiers, even larger siege towers, even greater determination to conquer. They fail too. Then another empire comes, then another, then another. For over 800 years they all fail. The question is not about the armies that attacked Constantinople, it is about what stopped them every single time. The answer was not magic, not luck, and not the bravery of defenders alone, it was engineering. The Theodosian Walls were not simply a barrier of stone, they were a machine designed to destroy armies. By the early 5th century, Constantinople had grown far beyond its original boundaries and first defensive walls. The city built by Constantine was bursting outward, spreading across new districts that had no protection whatsoever. The empire faced threats from every direction, Huns thundering across the steppes, Germanic tribes pressing from the west. If even one of these enemies reached Constantinople's exposed new districts, the entire Eastern Empire could collapse overnight. Something extraordinary had to be built, not just a wall, but a fortress system unlike anything before it. The man who ordered it built was Emperor Theodosius II, a young ruler surrounded by brilliant advisors and engineers. His Praetorian prefect, Anthemius, was the true architectural mind behind what would become history's most successful defensive system. Anthemius understood one fundamental truth about warfare: a wall is only as smart as its design. The project he planned would consume enormous quantities of stone, brick, mortar, timber, iron, and human labor for years. It would require engineers, surveyors, architects, quarry workers, stonecutters, brickmakers, transport workers, and thousands of general laborers every day. Construction began around the year 408 AD, stretching nearly 7 kilometers from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. First came the surveyors, walking the terrain with measuring rods, calculating ridgelines, slopes, and the most defensible ground positions. Every curve in the wall's path was deliberate. The engineers followed the land, not a straight line drawn on a map. Straight walls are easy to assault because every point along them is equally vulnerable to concentrated attacking force. Curved walls create angles, meaning defenders could fire along the face of the wall and catch attackers from the side. Was quarried from sites near the city and transported by cart and barge in enormous quantities every single day. Stone blocks formed the structural core, massive, heavy interlocking pieces that distributed weight across wide foundations below. Between the stone courses, builders inserted thick layers of Roman brick, creating a sandwich construction of incredible strength and flexibility. Roman concrete, a mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater, bonded everything together into a mass that hardened like iron. The foundations themselves were wide and deep, spreading the load of millions of tons of stone across the ground below. Here is where most people's understanding of the Theodosian Walls falls completely apart. They imagine a single enormous wall. One giant barrier of stone, perhaps 40 feet tall, standing between Constantinople and its enemies like a single line of defense. That picture is completely wrong. The Theodosian system was not a wall, it was 3 separate defensive lines built one behind another. The outermost line was a moat, 20 meters wide and around 7 meters deep, stretching the entire length of the walls. Attackers crossing that moat were not safely past the defenses. They had only entered the first killing ground of many more. Behind the moat rose the Protechisma, a low outer wall standing around 2 meters tall and equipped with its own battlements. Soldiers behind those battlements could launch arrows, spears, and stones at enemies still struggling across the flooded moat below. Behind the outer wall lay another open corridor, another killing zone where attackers had no cover and defenders had every advantage. Then came the outer main wall, rising nearly 9 meters tall, with a walkway along its top for defending soldiers. And behind that, separated by a broad terrace, rose the great inner wall itself, almost 12 meters tall and 5 meters thick. Towers were built into every layer of the system, spaced at intervals carefully calculated by engineers for maximum defensive coverage. The outer wall had towers. The inner wall had towers, 96 of them in total, rising even higher than the wall. From those towers, archers could fire not just outward toward the enemy, but along the face of the wall in both directions. This created overlapping fields of fire, zones where an attacker could be hit simultaneously from multiple positions with nowhere to hide. The towers also served as elevated observation platforms, ammunition storage depots, and communication nodes along the entire defensive line. A problem at one section could be signaled to commanders, and reinforcements could move along the sheltered terrace behind the walls immediately. Defenders never had to leave their protected positions to communicate or resupply. Everything was designed to keep them alive and effective. The genius of the system was that it multiplied the effective fighting power of every single defender standing behind those walls. One skilled archer behind the Theodosian Walls was worth the fighting power of 10 soldiers attacking across that killing ground below. Attackers had to cross the moat, survive the outer wall, survive the killing corridor, and then somehow assault the towering inner wall. The walls were tested for the first time almost immediately after completion, and they passed their first great test with astonishing ease. In 447 AD, Attila the Hun led an enormous force toward Constantinople. One of history's most feared commanders was coming. The walls had just been badly damaged by a catastrophic earthquake, toppling entire sections and throwing 57 towers to the ground. What happened next was extraordinary. The city mobilized every citizen, every guild, and every available worker to rebuild the fallen sections. In just 60 days, not only were the collapsed sections rebuilt, but an entirely new third outer wall was added to the system. When Attila arrived and saw triple lines of defense, rebuilt and stronger than before, he turned his army around and left. The man who had destroyed dozens of cities and defeated entire Roman armies looked at those walls and chose not to attack. In 626 AD, a combined Avar and Persian force, coordinating from both sides of the Bosphorus, besieged Constantinople with overwhelming numbers. The layered defense system performed exactly as designed. The moat stopped the siege towers cold before they reached the outer wall. The Avar siege towers were too heavy to cross the moat, collapsing into the water and stranding the attack completely. Defenders rained missiles down from multiple levels simultaneously, and within days the siege had turned into a catastrophe for the attackers. Arab forces tried twice, in 674 and again in 717, bringing fleets and armies that would have overwhelmed almost any other city. Both times the walls held. Both times attackers maintained costly sieges while supplies dwindled and disease tore through their camps. The Bulgarian Khan Krum arrived in 813, looked at the walls, and died before his siege ever properly began. The Rus attacked by sea in 860. The walls stopped their assault, and Byzantine naval power destroyed their fleet entirely. Each failed siege added engineering lessons. Weak sections were reinforced, design improvements were incorporated, and the system kept evolving with every threat. The walls required constant, dedicated maintenance. Not just after sieges, but every single year across decades and centuries of continuous service. Earthquakes were the wall's greatest non-military enemy. The region sat on active fault lines that could topple sections without any warning. Byzantine emperors established a permanent corps of engineers whose sole purpose was inspecting, repairing, and upgrading the wall system continuously. Damaged towers were rebuilt stronger. Sections where the moat had silted up were excavated and deepened back to their original dimensions. When new construction materials or techniques became available, engineers incorporated them. The walls were never allowed to simply age and weaken. This commitment to maintenance was itself a form of military strategy. A crumbling wall was more dangerous than no wall at all. For any attacking commander, the prospect of besieging the Theodosian Walls was a logistical nightmare of almost impossible proportions. A besieging army camped outside Constantinople needed to feed tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, and support workers every single day. The city behind those walls could receive supplies by sea indefinitely. The attackers outside had no such advantage and slowly starved. Time worked against every attacker, and in favor of every defender. The walls turned patience itself into the most powerful weapon. Disease spread through besieging camps crowded with men and animals pressed together in unsanitary conditions for months or years on end. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized they could not breach those walls by direct assault, no matter how brave or numerous they were. Commanders who had conquered entire kingdoms found themselves completely helpless before a defensive system that simply refused to be overwhelmed by force. The walls did not just defend Constantinople, they defended the entire Eastern Roman world behind them for century after century. Then, in the mid-15th century, warfare itself began to change in ways that no stone wall in history could fully answer. Gunpowder had been slowly spreading westward from China, and with it came a weapon that changed the mathematics of siege warfare forever. The cannon. A device that could concentrate enormous destructive force into a single projectile and hurl it against stone at tremendous speed. Early cannons were small and crude. They posed no serious threat to the massive Theodosian Walls at first. But Ottoman engineers were refining the technology at terrifying speed, casting larger and larger barrels capable of firing heavier and heavier stone balls. When Mehmed II began planning his assault on Constantinople in 1453, he commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build something extraordinary. Urban's cannon was enormous beyond any previous scale, capable of firing stone balls weighing over half a ton enormous distances. It was so large that it required 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to drag it into position before the walls. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman artillery opened fire against the Theodosian Walls, and for the first time in history, the walls shook. The wall system that had been designed to defeat ladders, siege towers, battering rams, and massed infantry had no answer for artillery. Each cannonball struck the same section of wall repeatedly, and unlike previous weapons, the damage accumulated instead of being absorbed. The defenders worked frantically every night to repair the breaches opened each day by the Ottoman bombardment, but the math was turning against them. The walls could be repaired, but not as fast as Urban's cannons could destroy them, and Mehmed had multiple batteries firing simultaneously. For 53 days the bombardment continued, reshaping sections of the greatest defensive system ever built into rubble and dust. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces poured through a breach in the walls in the final darkness, before dawn, and Constantinople fell. It is important to understand what actually happened in 1453. The Theodosian Walls did not fail because they were poorly built. They did not fail because their engineers had been careless, or because the defenders had been cowardly, or because the design was flawed. They fell because warfare itself had been fundamentally transformed by a technology that simply had not existed when those walls were designed. For over 800 years, from 408 AD to 1453, those walls had done exactly what Anthemius and his engineers designed them to do. They had stopped the Huns. They had stopped the Avars. They had stopped the Arabs, the Bulgarians, the Rus, and dozens more. They had protected an entire civilization through centuries of invasions, earthquakes, civil wars, plagues, and the slow collapse of the Western Empire. The secret of their success was never one single thing. It was the combination of everything working together as one unified system. The moat slowed attackers and neutralized siege towers. The outer wall absorbed the first assault. The killing corridors destroyed momentum entirely. The inner wall stood so tall and thick that even armies who reached it found themselves facing an obstacle beyond their engineering capability. The towers created crossfire that made every meter of approach ground a death zone for attackers no matter how they tried to advance. The materials, limestone, brick, and Roman concrete, created a composite structure more resilient than any single material could ever be alone. The maintenance culture ensured the system never weakened with age, remaining as formidable in the 11th century as it had been in the 5th. And the geography of Constantinople itself, surrounded on three sides by water, meant the walls only had to defend one direction perfectly. Today, Sections of the Theodosian Walls still stand in Istanbul, broken, weathered but present, rising from the ground after 16 centuries. You can walk along them and place your hand against stones cut and set by workers who lived before the fall of Rome. You can look up at towers that Attila the Hun turned away from, that Arab fleets broke against, that 100 armies failed to climb. Those walls did not just protect a city. They protected an idea that human intelligence applied to stone and geometry could hold back the world. For over 800 years, they proved that idea right. And no army that ever stood before them left those walls feeling anything but awe.